All right, welcome everybody. It is good to have you with us. I'm joined today by my colleague, Cathy Edwards, who will be doing a great presentation on strategic planning. We'll also have some time for Q&A. It'll be a really good session today. My name is Kyle. I'm the Director of Education here at Co-operatives First. As I just mentioned, we've been in operation for over 10 years. We work across Western Canada, supporting folks who want to start new cooperatives, raising awareness of co-ops, and providing educational resources to help cooperatives thrive. We've got a couple familiar faces here, but I'd love to do a round of introductions. We've probably got a few too many folks for that. So if you could take a moment and in the chat, let us know your name, where you're joining us from, and what organization you represent. So pop that in the chat, and then if maybe there's connections that can be made, they can happen in the chat. I'd like to start our meeting in a good way, and so I'll begin with a land acknowledgement and acknowledge that Co-operatives First's office is located in Saskatoon, which is on Treaty 6 territory, home of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Métis nations. We acknowledge that this land was not ceded, but that the purpose of the treaties was to ensure the land would be shared. Indigenous peoples have been cooperating in these territories for thousands of years, and it is through cooperation that all our communities will continue to thrive. We're, of course, joined today by folks from all across Turtle Island and beyond, and so I invite you to take a moment and acknowledge the people and the ancestors of the place that you call home. Hey, just for those who just joined us, if you drop your name, where you're joining us from, and the organization you represent in the chat, that's a great way for us all to get to know each other a little bit. But I'll introduce our speaker for today's session, Cathy Edwards. Cathy is our entrepreneur in residence at Co-operatives First. She guides steering committees deftly through the process of planning their business. She helps groups identify their markets, gauge their feasibility of their plans, pull together a budget, and much, much more. Cathy has a bachelor's degree of commerce from the University of Saskatchewan and a law degree from the University of Calgary. She left law, however, to pursue entrepreneurial ventures and hasn't looked back. She has a passion for startups and has successfully launched and managed several ventures, including Heart-Linked Community Services Cooperative, one of our favorite success stories here at Cooperatives First. And in 2023, Cathy was the recipient of the YWCA's Women of Distinction Award for Entrepreneurship. Cathy, over to you.
Thanks, Kyle, and welcome everyone. It's so exciting to see such a broad cross-section of cooperative folks in our chat. I welcome you to the session and I thank you so much for attending today. I hope you find something helpful in my discussion, and as always, am approachable for dialogue afterwards if you need to reach out or send me an email. So I just want to check, Kyle, is the screen share working appropriately? Terrific. We'll get rolling. So as Kyle introduced me, I am the entrepreneur in residence, and notwithstanding any academic accolades, my biggest pride is being involved with a number of businesses, including a not-for-profit cooperative of my own that I participate in. And I can honestly say that it's my time in the trench that has provided the very best education. So I want to take a brief look at our agenda for today. I'm really excited. Strategic planning would be probably at the very top of my list for engagements I enjoy working with businesses of all sorts. We'll talk a bit about the importance of strategic planning and setting the stage for an effective process. We'll look at participation in the process as it relates to cooperatives. And we'll take a look at the key steps for what a strategic planning session needs to encompass and how to implement your success measures of success. So, of course, we'll leave time for any questions at the conclusion of the presentation. So I'm sure that this is a statistic that most of you are aware of, whether you're a cooperative or not. A relatively high percentage of small businesses drop out of existence after the first year, and only 35% of startups make it to the 10-year mark. So when people ask about the importance of strategic planning, I very clearly say a strategic plan is an investment in your longevity. Most organizations invest a significant amount of time and attention to the startup phase and the development of an initial business plan. And while this is really critically important to ensure that the concept is feasible and you can launch successfully, once operational, it can be really easy to keep going through the motions of your day-to-day work in the organization without assessing the overall progress and direction of the enterprise. So, strategic planning is nothing more than carving out dedicated time and attention to creating a roadmap for your cooperative. A solid business plan can get you through years 1 through 3, but a commitment to regular strategic planning can help ensure long-term success by building and executing internal benchmarks. So at Cooperatives First, we're about all things cooperatives. And while the cooperative structure often warrants unique considerations, the fundamentals of strategic planning are universal. The need to draft and detail how to execute a future plan is vital for any organization, regardless of its legal structure. So we all know that the heart of every cooperative is its members. So membership voice needs to be strongly represented in the strategic planning process. Engagement in strategic planning will look differently for every cooperative, largely according to the size and complexity of the organization. In smaller cooperatives, the membership base may not be dramatically different from the composition of the board. So the need for outside engagement may not be relevant. But with larger cooperatives, when a strategic plan is contemplating any major shift or recalibration of the goals of the cooperative, the membership base needs to be engaged to some degree. And I think the critical takeaway from all of this, cooperative or not, is to include not only the board, which is at a minimum the representation of your membership, but good strategic planning also needs to incorporate the volunteers or employees who actually help to carry out or execute the plan. Plans are only successful if they can be carried out. So I always say you need to consult the guy in the trench or the guy running the tool. This is not a job for the board in isolation. Clearly, the ability to execute on an operational level will be critical for success. So once you've identified who needs to participate from within your organization, the number one shortfall is allocating sufficient time and attention to the process. I usually recommend that it's a good idea to find a good offsite location that will be free of distractions. If you stay in the office or try and execute the process in regular meeting times, you often are inclined to carry on with business as usual. So depending on the complexity of the organization, an in-depth strategic planning process can take anywhere between 1 and 3 days. It is something that can be done internally, but it is often advantageous to bring in a third-party facilitator to help steer and navigate the process. Another consideration as you're sort of setting the stage for a fruitful engagement is to consider how you want to either employ or avoid the use of technology in the planning sessions. And given the level of connectivity that we all enjoy, it is really difficult to create a haven where people can focus on this work without the distractions of email, texts, and client needs. I've even gone so far as to employ a classic workbook and pencils to ensure that everybody is invested in the same page on the same time to really get the most out of this important process. So once you are ready to get rolling and plan with your team, it's really important to start at a high level and take the bird's eye view. And this is going right back to basics. So for any of you who have attended prior sessions that we've had on fundraising and or the biz plan generator, we talk about the need for a business plan as one of your fundamental tools to start any organization. And part of the backbone of your business plan is your mission, vision, and organizational values. So this is a key opportune time to review the mission, vision, and values of your organization and ensure they still fit and are reflective of where you want your cooperative to be going. Things can evolve over time, and ensuring that everyone is aligned is key to a successful process. So just as a quick refresher, your mission statement is that concise declaration that outlines an organization's core purpose, what they do, who they serve, and why it matters. It's essentially your North Star, and it is your present view, what you are doing now. Your vision statement is future looking and aspirational. It describes the ideal ultimate impact you want to achieve. And that's why having alignment on those core two identified statements is really important, because that should ripple down throughout your strategic planning process to help you set your targets and goals accordingly. Identifying and restating your corporate values is also important, and those are your foundational beliefs and guiding principles that dictate your organization's culture, daily operations, and long-term strategy. As I said, these things can and do change over time, so they need to be organic and reflective of where the cooperative is going in the future. So the next step in the planning process is to really take a good in-depth look at your current landscape. So this is to review current information about the status of the cooperative, including if there is an existing business plan, the most recent configuration of it, financial statements, annual reports, or any other documentation, which could be proposed agreements, key client contracts, proposed legislation or regulatory changes coming down the pipeline, any relevant information that has had a big impact on the past or the potential future of the cooperative. It is also really important to assemble and share consistent information with everyone who will be participating in the strategic planning process. So if you have a facilitator, it's really important to assemble this documentation in advance, and it helps set the tone for effective use of time. In addition to compiling documentation, one of the personal practices I use and I would highly recommend is to conduct or have someone conduct a one-on-one interview with all of the participants in the strategy session. This ensures that all key voices have the opportunity to be heard, especially if there are potential power dynamics or situational challenges. Even in organizations that function completely harmoniously, I have found in my practice that individuals really appreciate the opportunity to share one-on-one in a very safe environment and can offer really candid insights and feedback that may otherwise be stifled or filtered in a group environment. This feedback can then be gathered and injected into the process in an anonymous way by the facilitator or interviewer. So it's a really nice way of ensuring you have true 360-degree view from the people in your organization. So once the team is fully informed of the current position of the cooperative, you need to start with conducting situational analysis. And this simply means finding a method of evaluating all of these internal and external factors that impact your cooperative, both now and what might be coming down the path in the future. So there are a number of tools available out there, such as the SWOT analysis or a PESTLE analysis. These are all just different ways of creating containers or categories to focus your thinking and ensure that you've done a comprehensive evaluation. So there's no necessarily right or wrong answer here. Use a tool that resonates with your group and your style of business. At a minimum, identifying market trends and the impact on your customers or clients is essential. And that's true whether you're running a for-profit or a not-for-profit. Really, at least be having your finger on the pulse of what is happening with who you are trying to serve is of critical importance. So knowing your opportunities or your biggest obstacles will help you craft more realistic and achievable goals. So with a fresh awareness of the current landscape, my recommendation is to always start big, work backwards, and then get really granular. So what I mean by start big, I always use the phrase blue sky with the clients I work with. And that is looking at the aspirational situation of the cooperative at a particular point in the future. Paint a portrait of where you want to be in either 3 or 5 years' time. I recommend that is sort of the maximum trajectory to use when you want to do really key strategic planning, because you have to get very granular in your planning to be effective. So looking at where you want to be in the future helps you define what success means for your cooperative. And it's different for every cooperative. Some cooperatives I've worked with, just being able to get to a position where they have paid full-time staff and have been able to migrate away from volunteer power was one of their key goals that we set for a 3-year goal. In other cooperatives, it may be sales targets, return on investment, or general growth in output. You have to make sure that whatever you choose as a goal is a measurable output. Continuity of service may be one potential goal, or growing the number of members involved in your cooperative would be another potential goal. You want to take time to refine and clearly establish these future goals, reflecting on what was identified in your situational analysis. So these become your key targets and establish the framework of your strategic plan. I always ask clients to take a loop back once you've established, a certain number of goals. Usually it's in the 3 to 5 goals that you can really focus in on. Do these goals align with the mission and vision that you have just reestablished or recalibrated? Make sure everything is on the same track. Then you want to deconstruct your goal and break it down into intervals or interim goals. So that's the working backwards process. If you have set a 3-year goal, for example, you'll want to then break it down and have either a 2-year, 1-year reporting session, or an 18-month or 6-month and 3-month reporting session. And again, there's no magic to setting these timelines. It's really about how it will work for your cooperative and when does it make sense to accumulate and review that data. That's what drives the bus on those timelines. Now we're going to talk about getting granular. So getting granular means identifying those measurable tasks and events that need to be monitored to achieve your goals. And this should be broken down to every level of the organization. So identify what you need to measure and how you will measure it. Sounds very simple, but this is something that can get sticky for a lot of organizations that I've worked with. So you need to make sure you have, I say, compartments or departments with standard operating procedures. And ultimately, a successful organization is one that can have a perpetual existence. Part of being perpetual means that information and processes are retained by the cooperative and not the individual. And ironically, what I have seen is that it is very common, a very common organizational failure when there are super competent staff in place. The system is just running because the staff are really good at what they do. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there's organizational competency. So there's nothing magic about the process, but you need to ensure you are having your staff build standing operating procedures so that if star employee A gets hit by a bus, there's the opportunity for the cooperative to continue perpetually in the future because there's a procedure that outlines what that person has effectively done. It also ties into your strategic planning process because it dictates where to measure performance and creates accountability. So having an understanding of what departments drive what mechanisms forward is really critical. So now we're going to get into some of the jargon that is really, really popular or that you'll hear a lot about when people are talking about strategic planning and evaluating the performance of an organization. And it really boils down to something very simple. So just after the days of the horse and buggy, when I was in driver's education, my driver's ed teacher had a rule that really I think of more often than I care to admit. And it is a rule that can be applied in almost every circumstance in life. Look where you want to go and steer there. So it seems simple, but it often gets murky. So many organizations don't actualize the momentum that can be created from a strategic planning process because their plans don't get granular enough. They haven't figured out how to steer there. So setting objectives and key results needs to be disseminated down to every level of the organization. And you will do that through your KPIs, which is another one of those fancy acronyms we'll talk about in a minute. So strong OKRs, which are your objectives and key results, have some key components. They have two structural components, the what and the how. What are we trying to achieve and how are we going to do it? And those are underscored by three key principles. They're focused and aspirational, meaning there is a direct path from A to B and I know where B is. They're time bound. So, and this is an element that you're going to see repeated again and again throughout all of the tools that are established to facilitate strategic planning. And that is timelines. So you have to be able to identify when that result is going to be measured. And transparency. Again, hearkening back to the beginning of our presentation, the guy in the trench, he or she needs, or they need to understand exactly what it is that they contribute that's helping perpetuate the organizational goal. So as promised, more jargon. So we have our OKRs, which are our objectives and key results. And now we talk about KPIs, which are your key performance indicators. These are the granular bits that these processes will make sure you're achieving your objectives and your key results. So getting granular matters. And while some KPIs can be relatively common across any type of organization, it is important to really dial in on your own cooperative's unique values and goals. Many of the groups that we incorporate are not-for-profit or community service cooperatives. So profitability or sales might not be a good KPI. Member growth or engagement might be equally important considerations for your cooperative. However, you will want to ensure that there are some financial metrics for any organization to be viable. And so that's my old accounting hat that I just can't fully remove. Having an eye on the numbers needs to be done at all times to ensure that you can keep the lights on. So maybe there are indicators related to the cost of service delivery or overall overhead cost reductions. And one more acronym that we'll throw, I lied, there's actually two. One is the second last acronym that we'll throw at you is the SMART framework to help you establish what your key performance indicators are. So it helps you direct and shape the KPIs for your organization. So they're specific, clearly defined, and focused. So take it to the lowest common denominator possible, down to, are you tracking the clicks on your organizational website? Are you reviewing how many people link through your emails and opening attachments? Things like that you can monitor at a very granular level, track and report on, will help you monitor and dial in on the health of your cooperative. Make sure that data is measurable and tracked. So if you can't measure it, it's not going to be a good performance indicator. So when you talk about member engagement, the fact that people thought that the AGM was enjoyable, that's really hard to gauge. But if you're noticing that year after year, you have more and more attendance and participation, that's something that's measurable. Achievable. I'm not just the new show about menopausal women on CBC, but small achievable goals are also good in the context of your current resources of your cooperative. So here I'll use an example from my own participation in our Heart-Linked Community Service Cooperative. We've had a goal to expand our retreat offerings. We do retreats with high-risk Indigenous youth from Northern communities. So when looking at what we were going to establish for our goals, it couldn't purely be demand-based. If we were to answer demand, we would have to add 20 or 30 retreats a year. Doing something like that would pull all of our core staff and volunteers away from delivering programming into trying to find funds to actualize all of those retreats. So we had to pick a number that was somewhere in between what the client demand was and what was realistic for the bandwidth of our organization. So it's balancing all of that analysis that you've done and taking a realistic test of the temperature about what is achievable for your organization. So we landed on two new retreats, knowing that once we start in a community, we stay in a community. It was a bit of a stretch, but we know we could successfully execute. And then you can build upon that success moving forward. So relevancy, again, looping back and making sure that your target aligns with the overall cooperative objectives, those mission, vision, and values. That needs to be integral to every person in your organization, should know what that North Star is. And again, the theme with time bound. Set incremental periods for measurement to make sure that you are on the right path. And if you're measuring and not seeing any results, the earlier you get that feedback, the easier it is to adapt. So now that you've taken time to go through the strategic planning process, and again, that's a very high-level summary of sort of the phases that you need to move through from an analytical perspective. As with all things, implementation is absolutely key. And so it's not really an acronym, but I have my 3 T's. Timelines are essential. So not only timelines for measuring those key performance indicators and how they fuel your key objectives. It's also about the timelines, about when you're going to bring your group back together and evaluate where you are in terms of executing your strategic plan. It may be annually, it may be every 2 years, but there has to be a period of reporting back and reviewing everything that you've established. The other T is a taskmaster. So this is one of those situations where if you have the means to appoint a third-party facilitator, it is really nice to have somebody who's outside of the regular operations of the organization, dialed in and making sure that dot is moving forward, and reporting on alignment. If you have an internal person that can do it, that is terrific, but somebody needs to be assigned to be the taskmaster. And again, transparency. And what's really important, if you aren't able to, if you have a very large organization or cooperative and you can't engage a wide cross section of employees, and you can only engage key personnel, setting aside time to ensure that the results of the strategic planning session have been summarized, distilled, and circulated so that each operational team can review, ask questions, and really organically understand what implementation means is really of critical importance. And last but not least, the only thing constant in life is change. I think we all know that. But having your fingers firmly on the pulse of your organization will put you in a better position to navigate unexpected changes or outside forces. So agility and adaptability are easier when you're actively monitoring how your organization is performing. And that's what this is all about. So engagement to all levels of the cooperative will not only build cohesion, but it promotes creative solutions from people who are often closest to the issues. So I want to reiterate, the board is an important part of this process as they are reflective of membership, but the people who execute the day-to-day activities also need a voice in a strategic plan that is executable. So that brings me to a conclusion of the formal part of our presentation, and I am happy to stop sharing and answer any questions.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Cathy. If folks do have questions, feel free to maybe use the raise hand function or add them to the chat. Since I'm hosting, I'm going to go ahead and take the first question. What would you say are the key differences between business plans and strategic plans, and how do you think co-op leaders or boards should handle the implementation of both?
Okay, so that's a terrific question. Part of the answer to that question is the lens or the user of the planning document. Often, business plans are created for dissemination to third parties, particularly if you're looking for investment, either from a financial institution or through the sale of investment shares, or you need to propose to engage with people outside of the organization. I think the trend with business planning is, and in my mind, rightfully so, should be to present more of a distilled document, to get away from the 40 or 50-page business plan and provide something that is really more of an executive summary that invites more dialogue. It is very difficult for any end user to digest everything about your business in a business plan. So I usually recommend that that's not the way to do it. Your strategic plan and process, on the other hand, is very internal. And the more nitty gritty and granular you get, the higher the chance of success. So I think bearing in mind to the second part of your question is how do cooperative leaders or leaders, implement each of those plans? I think internally, the creation of a strategic plan should engage a really wide cross-section of engagement within the organization. And much of that can be distilled and refined to be summarized into a business plan. Certainly, they're integrated to a certain degree, but there's a lot more fundamental pieces to a strategic plan that speak to your operational and your performance indicators that you wouldn't necessarily detail in a business plan.
Maybe picking up on a comment you made there, honing in on the who of the strategic planning process. Who should be involved in strategic planning? Would you have some advice on what consultations would look like for a smaller organization, maybe like Heartling, versus say a larger co-op, like some of those we have in the break, like Westview or Homestead co-ops, or Federated, I think is the biggest audience that's joined us.
For sure. So for a small organization, there might not be much of a distinction between your board and your whole membership base. So in that case, it's pretty easy to ensure that there is engagement across the process. But in our scenario, we do have key players that we want their feedback. They may not be on our board of directors, but for example, we engage with the Northern Lights School Division because they are a representative of the client that we serve. So while they may not participate in an entire strategic planning process, we may choose to integrate them into key parts of the dialogue to make sure that what we're delivering is what our end user needs and wants to see. So that's an example. When you're dealing with a really, really large organization that is highly complex, large boards, many operating divisions, I would say to take it at a two-stage approach. I would have key employees or representatives from your operations as well as your board participate in the in-depth process. But I would also have mechanisms for departments to provide a feedback loop to things that come out of the planning process. So again, it's that dissemination of information and the transparency to all levels to ensure that there's uptake.
Fair. I think maybe for those who attended the webinar we hosted last month on governance challenges or governance ideas for co-ops, I think there's a pretty good cross section between the strategic planning process and stakeholder governance theory with respect to who ought to be considered, who ought to be consulted or included in the planning process. I'll maybe do a quick check-in. Is there any questions for Cathy from folks in the audience? Okay, moving on. I have a few more questions I wouldn't mind hearing. At what point would you say you should retain professional services to help with a strategic plan? Do you think professionals should be included at every step of the strategic planning process? And maybe like where would you find folks for strategic planning support?
Good question. So I really think it depends on the situation of each particular co-op. And I know that seems like a kind of a pat answer, but I can preface that with, if things are relatively smooth operationally, there is a lot of background information that an organization can do to collect information and prepare for a strategic planning session and really limit the amount of outside involvement. It is always terrific to have a facilitator at least run the focused day and then the follow-up reporting, because it's really easy for things like that to fall off of somebody's desk when they get back to the regular day-to-day business. Where I would highly recommend engaging a professional in the process is if the organization is having some challenges, either interpersonally or from a perspective where facilitation might help some of the quieter voices, or if there's particular challenges getting from A to B. Having a third party outside perspective and get down into detail on some of the organizational obstacles might help you create new pathways and sort of pivot and get momentum. So it really is an evaluation of really how difficult the road ahead of you is, and whether you think outside support is going to be warranted to achieve those goals.
Great question. And then in terms of where would you look to for experts? Because there's no, strategic planners are us. Is there a certification or network or group or association that that you'd maybe recommend people start if they're considering recruiting an expert for strategic planning?
This also works, in really generic circumstances. Talk to an organization you trust. So it's really hard to, you can Google and you can, I'm sure there are coaching certifications. Does that necessarily mean that that individual is going to be the right fit for your organization? Possibly not. Talk to an organization or professional that your cooperative does work with and trust, and see if they have recommendations. Ultimately, it's less about finding somebody who's necessarily knowledgeable about your particular industry, as it is finding a personality that is really going to gel well with our organization values, your vibe, and how you want to get things done. If you really want to go through an intensive strategic planning process, you want to have a facilitator that can really help pull out all of the good information and disseminate it in a way that your staff and board will be receptive to. So it's about finding a good personality fit just as much as it is finding a good educational fit.
Yeah, agreed. We do have a couple questions in the chat. Christine asks, if it's a governance board, can you still get granular?
I think so, because good governance requires all of the same benchmarks in terms of, establishing what the goals are for the organization and how you're going to measure success. So getting granular, I think, looks a little bit different. Certainly, you're not going to be talking about the operational procedures of serving clients, but certainly getting granular so that you understand what you're trying to measure and who is responsible for tracking that data, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I would also note too, it's normal to have management input to help the board connect what the operations look like with the strategy that they're proposing, so that you can really hone in on what those KPIs might be.
Yeah.
Another question from Ken: how soon would you recommend actually forming a co-op or a housing co-op that is in its early days? That's a good question. There's lots of buzz around housing at the moment with some funding programs. Cathy, do you have any thoughts?
Well, depending on your jurisdiction, there's a minimum number of people that you need to be involved. So here in Saskatchewan, the magic number is 3. So you can't have a co-op. Oh, is it more now? Sorry. Oh, I thought you were shaking your head.
No.
So it can't be a co-op of 1, essentially, is the short answer, Ken. But I would say you probably want to have a pretty committed group and have a realistic purview on what it takes to get a housing co-op off the ground. There are very few sources of seed funding available right now. And that tends to be the biggest barrier that I've worked through with a number of groups. But if you are in one of those situations that you're from a community that either has land available or a seed funding program, then certainly we'd invite you to reach out to us and formulate and officially incorporate with one of our team members who can guide you through that process.
Yeah, I would say worst case scenario, if you create the co-op part too early, you might amend things a little bit down the road. You might, it might not work out funding wise, and then you just, dissolve the co-op or let it fall off the record. That'd be the worst case scenario. So I would say there's no harm in creating the co-op part early because you're ready for when those things present themselves. Another question from Susan. What would you do if you had a series of strategic planning sessions that are stalled at the mission, vision, value stage, but are struggling to set the OKR/KPI? I have thoughts on this.
Great question, because that is something that a lot of people can get hung up on. And this is one of those situations where having an outside facilitator for even part of your strategic planning process can sometimes help pull you out of the weeds and bring a fresh perspective and fresh approach. That's sometimes the nice thing about involving a third party or outside facilitator. But really, it's hard to progress if you can't get alignment on the core mission, vision, and values of the organization. It's virtually impossible to set the goals because it's those core, the core beliefs of why the cooperative exists that drives everything forward. So my best advice to you would be to try and bring in somebody from the outside to facilitate and see if it can sort of get you unstuck.
Yep. I would also echo agree to a process that sort of guarantees forward momentum. So, set timelines to things, require that, votes be cast, decisions get made. It might not feel as cooperative or as inclusive as maybe it ought to be, but, forward progress kind of has to happen for some of these things. Otherwise, yeah, you'll get stalled out, it'll delay things, you may lose out on opportunities, you might not grow as an organization. So, yeah, the need for forward momentum is essential. So, try and define maybe like a terms of reference for your board or your team for the strategic planning process that, again, sets an agreement for how we're going to move past hangups like that. Okay, not seeing any other questions. Cathy, maybe to wrap us up, are there any resources, educational materials, courses you've taken that you liked that you would recommend co-ops or credit unions that are seeking more information on strategic planning take a look at?
Thanks. So I think at the core of good strategic planning is knowing how to have difficult conversations. So having your leadership tied into mechanisms that facilitate and bringing all of the voices to the table. I think that's the number one takeaway. There are so many resources available online with strategies and acronyms and all of those things. But ultimately, successful strategic planning comes down to personal relationships and ensuring that there is adequate dialogue and adequate communication within the strategic planning session and then disseminating down to the group. So that's my number one takeaway is perfect the art of facilitation.
Absolutely. I'll do a quick plug as well for coopcreator.ca. It's our resource website that we maintain at Cooperatives First. We've got a tool on strategic planning that provides some tips on how to work through things like a SWOT analysis or a PESTLE analysis. If folks are doing that sort of work themselves, it gives a good starting point, I would say, that you can adapt for your co-op. Okay, final question was from Chris. Will a copy of this be available or sent out to those registered? Yes, I will share the recording via email either later this week or early next week once we get it up on the website. All right, that is a wrap for this afternoon. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I hope to see y'all again soon. We're going to take a little bit of a break from webinars at Cooperatives First for the summer, but expect to hear from me again with another webinar coming up probably around August. Okay, take care, everybody, and we'll chat again soon.
Thanks, Cathy. Thanks, Kyle.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great day.